Welcome to the lecture on a semiotic analysis of toys and games. Most of you have probably played with at least one of the toys or games pictured, if not more. But have you ever thought about them analytically? What messages, intentional or unintentional, do the games convey? What cultural values do they promote? How do we even begin to analyze toys and games? Well, here are some things to consider when doing a semiotic analysis of a toy or game. Some of these obviously apply, whereas some don't, depending on what your toy or game is. Look at the game board. Don't just look at the pathway a player takes in the game, but examine the images, wording, spacing, etc. on it. Game pieces. Maybe they are just different colors, but if there is anything unique about them, you might want to consider why they look the way they do. Any other parts of the game, such as if there are special dice, a spinner, etc. For the video games, are there interesting avatars, special bonus features, etc.? Rules of the game. Are there any unique rules to the game? Are there rules of how to interact with the toy? How players interact with each other? Is the game cooperative, competitive, humorous, introspective? This could be applied to toys as well. How do people, especially children, interact with the game or the toy? History of the game. Sometimes it's important while other times it's not. Only include this information if you use the history as some type of evidence in your analysis. Socialization. This is probably one of the most significant ones to address. This is where most of your analysis will occur. What do I mean by socialization? I mean, does the toy or game somehow influence the users to follow certain behaviors and ideologies? Do the toys or games reinforce gender roles, racial stereotypes, class structures, occupations, attitudes? For example, some theorists argue that Barbie is teaching children to become consumers, since it's not enough just to own a Barbie. Instead, children need to constantly accessorize, which means buying more and more products for Barbie. Barbie is training kids to buy. Placement in the toy store. What I mean by this is that toy stores seem to have a boys section and a girls section. Just this alone, this separation, suggests that toys reinforce certain gender roles. Which of these two sections is the toy placed in? Or is it placed somewhere else? Again, sometimes this is important, but sometimes it's not. Let's take a look at one specific game, Monopoly. The reason I chose this game to analyze is because not only does Glassberg discuss it in the article, but this seems to be a game that is played universally. I've had students come from many different countries, and almost all of them have been exposed to Monopoly at some point. So let's look at the various signs that I just outlined in the previous slide as they relate to Monopoly. If you look at the Monopoly game board, what are some interesting things you notice? You might want to pause the presentation here so you could brainstorm on your own. Here are some things I noticed. You might have come up with different things than mine, which is fine. These are just examples of the types of observations you can make. So I noticed that neighborhoods are segregated based on economic class. Sometimes just one street can separate the rich from the poor, such as the division between Boardwalk and Mediterranean Avenue. Do you think I'm making this up? Go visit the area around USC in Southern California. One street is sparkling with the rich, and the next is inner city LA. How do such disparities come to play? Okay, let me get back to the game itself. The jail is located in the low rent district, while the police present guards the high rent districts. Coincidence or not? Again, does this occur in real life? Thoughts to ponder. Oakland Hills has police. Oakland does not have as much. Think about it. Payday is at regular intervals and automatic, regardless if you have done a good job or not at your work. Geez, is this true? I've had many jobs in my life, and I don't know how many times I've seen a terrible worker get paid just because he or she showed up to work, even if he or she didn't do any work. It was just an automatic check. The income tax property spot occurs soon after payday, possibly suggesting that taxes are one of the first drains on your income. The path of the game is cyclical rather than linear. In other words, you go around in circles, or I guess squares, rather than starting at point A and ending up at point Z. Think about why this might be important in terms of the real world. The luxury tax has two spots, one in the low rent districts and one in the high rent districts. This suggests that taxes apply to everyone, not just certain classes. There are a limited number of properties, so the amount of land that can be purchased will eventually run out. Let's take a look at the community chest cards now. I know these are a little difficult for you to see, but you might be able to zoom in if you have PowerPoint, or I'm not sure if it'll work on YouTube, but maybe using the full screen version will help. Now, Glassberg mentions that a white man controls the power in most cards that include both the community chest and the chance cards. I don't necessarily agree with this, since there are also a lot of cards in which that character is penalized or has to pay for something. Still, I included it because it was an observation made in the article. There are 2 cards about paying the hospital or a medical bill. Although 2 might not seem like a lot, when there are only 15 cards total, and when most of the cards are positive, it seems odd that of the negative ones, 2 are about paying medical bills. What is this suggesting about medical insurance or services? There are many different ways money can be acquired, from others, meaning other players, inheritance, stock, life insurance, salaries, maturity funds, tax refunds, or just plain old chance. As I said, there are more positive cards than negative. Going to and getting out of jail is based on randomness. They're totally random. So let's take a look at the chance cards now. Interestingly, 8 out of the 16 cards, so half of the cards, are about advancing, while only 1 is about going backwards. Does this convey a sense of hope in terms of progressing in life or advancing in life? Well, in the game, sometimes advancing is helpful, but sometimes it's not. If you've ever played the game, you will understand that whether you own property or not makes all the difference. If it's early in the game, you want to get out of jail right away so that you can try to land on and buy properties. However, later in the game, if you don't own many properties, there are not many places you can land that will be free of rent. Being in jail for 3 turns is actually helpful because you can avoid huge rent payments, so you don't want to advance. Is this similar to the real world? For the poorest of the poor, does jail offer free room and board without having to pay rents to anyone? That's a really sad reality to bring up, since obviously losing one's freedom and being in a setting such as jail would be terrible to most of us. However, doesn't that show just how terrible some people's conditions are, that jail might be considered some type of shelter? When properties aren't built yet and land is available, being in jail is considered a negative thing. It's a problem. But when the society has become so rigidified in its class structure that there is no upward mobility, jail might be considered a better place to be than in a world that is too costly for the poor. There are cards in both community chest and chance that do suggest the rich have some costs to being rich, that is, they have to pay for property repairs. One interesting idea is that political or social power can be bought and sold. For example, the chairman has to pay other players money. When I grew up playing this, I've always wondered why. I always thought, why do I have to pay? Why can't they pay me? So is this like paying for their votes? Also, the get out of jail free card can be sold. Can people buy their freedom out of the court system? Think about what's going on in the world right now. Even though this is a game that young kids play, there are 2 cards showing someone smoking as a positive thing. What about the playing pieces or the property cards? Well, if you look at the property cards of Boardwalk and Mediterranean Avenue, the rent is 25 times greater for Boardwalk than Mediterranean. Also, the rent doubles or increases significantly more if an owner owns all colors in a set and has built houses or hotels. The hotels bring in more rent than the houses. Transportation and utilities can be owned. I guess our modern day equivalent of that is privatization. It's fairly easy to borrow money if you own property, simply by mortgaging the property. But without property to begin with, there's no chance of getting a loan. The paying of utilities is not stable. It relies on chance. In other words, what you rolled on the dice. Does Does that sound like gasoline prices these days? I have no idea how those are working right now. The playing pieces seem to represent a diversity of social classes. That is, if we accept that the car, top hat, which is usually worn with a tuxedo, and ship are signs of wealth and leisure, whereas the wheelbarrow and iron are signs of the working class or manual labor. We could also attempt to group the playing pieces into genders, where traditional males are associated with anything outside the home, including business, and traditional female roles are associated with the domestic space, such as ironing. Please don't think I'm stereotyping. I'm just addressing traditional meanings of signs, which I seldom agree with, though. Or if ever. The hotels are larger than houses, but that seems a little obvious to me. Only a limited number of houses and hotels are available and can be built. The rules expressly state that once these are used, more cannot be built. You cannot use some substitute to build houses or hotels. In contrast, there seems to be an unlimited amount of money. In fact, the rules say that you can go ahead and create more money by writing on slips of paper if you need to. The $500 bill is in gold. Again, a little obvious. So, the rules of the game. You might want to take a look at the rules to the game. I've included a link here if you're interested in looking at the rules more closely. There are so many rules, but I want to point out some interesting ones that you might not be aware of or might not have thought of very analytically or just happen to stand out to me. If you forget to collect rent, you can't collect it later. If only real life were like that. The bank has almost all the power. It holds all the money, distributes paychecks, pays bonuses, sells properties, collects his taxes, etc., etc., etc. If only real life were not like that. As I said earlier, the bank can keep issuing money on slips of paper. It never goes broke. Throwing doubles 3 times in a row lands you in jail. Is there a sense that too much good luck can result in bad luck? I've already covered this one about having a monopoly on properties of the same color. And I've also covered the fact that players cannot loan each other money. So this really discourages cooperative play. The player with money left after all other players are bankrupt wins the game. This isn't even about the player with the most money. It's about getting to the point where nobody has money but yourself. These next few categories might be important for your particular toy or game, but I'm going to go through them fairly quickly because I've either covered them already or they aren't as applicable. So for player interaction, we've already established that the style of play is aggressive and competitive, not collaborative. Also, it might lead to being secretive, since hiding your $500 bills will allow you to bargain and deal with your opponents more easily. They don't know how much money you really have. Well, at least that's what I did. Sorry. Well, here's some interesting history, but I don't know if there's much I would do with it in my semiotic analysis. Maybe you can think of something. If you do, email me and I'll include it the next time I offer this course. Store placement. Since Monopoly is placed in the game section, I don't think that the store placement is really relevant here. So this is one of the most important slides of this presentation. What is the game teaching children? Consciously or subconsciously, or intentionally or unintentionally. Some positives are that it's teaching them how to get along and how to follow fair rules of fair play. But a negative is that it's teaching them that following the rules is important with no questioning of the rules. It's also teaching them that competition is important rather than cooperation. It could possibly be suggesting that many circumstances are dictated by luck. After all, the whole game is based on rolling dice. And finally, it presents many social inequalities. If you were to write a paper on this game, these would be your possible thesis points. You couldn't cover all of them, but based on the evidence that we just brainstormed, you can see that you would have evidence to prove your points. That's it. We're done with this lecture. Hopefully you have a clearer idea of how to address your own text, meaning a toy or a game. Thanks a lot.